On the morning of January 8, 1937, the severely mutilated body of Pamela Werner was found near the Fox Tower in Beijing, China, just outside the city's legation quarter. The only child of sinologist and retired British diplomat E.T.C. Werner, Pamela had last been seen by acquaintances just before leaving a skating rink the previous night. No one was ever charged in the case. In 1919, the Werners adopted a 2-year-old girl, whom they named Pamela, from the orphanage run by Portuguese nuns at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, or South Church, in Peking. Pamela's biological parentage was not known, although her fair complexion and gray eyes suggest that she was, like many of the other orphans at the South Church, the offspring of exiled Russian whites. After Gladys died of what was said to have been a drug overdose while being treated for meningitis in 1922, Werner devoted much of his life to Pamela, teaching her Chinese, to the point that she was fluent from a very early age. Later she would emulate her father by traveling around the city on her bicycle, often unaccompanied. Outside the home, Werner wrote books and articles about China, researched the language and its many dialects on long walks around Beijing, and occasionally lectured at Peking University. The Werners lived, like a growing number of foreigners, outside the city's heavily secured legation quarter, a cramped area of about 0.50 square miles, that was the only extraterritorial portion of the city, in contrast to the more populous treaty ports of Shanghai and Tientsin, now Tianjin. Among their neighbors in the Hudong, where they lived in a modernized sihiyuan, or courtyard house, were the Snows. Werner sent Pamela to the private schools that catered to the city's more affluent foreigners. At the end of 1936, Pamela was on holiday from Tientsin Grammar School. In the wake of some incidents there that may possibly have involved Sidney Yates, the school's headmaster, making sexual overtures to her, Werner was preparing to send his daughter back to England to continue her education, a move Pamela did not welcome. Werner feared his growing daughter was maintaining too active a social life for a woman her age and was also worried about some of the young men who had attempted to court her. He had hit one of them, a young Chinese man, with his cane in front of the house during a confrontation. On the last day of her life, Pamela went to a dental appointment in the morning and then returned home to write letters. She left the family home in the late afternoon. Hoing, a servant who typically went out to purchase food around 3 p.m. daily, informed her at the time he was doing so and asked her if, as was often the case, she wanted him to buy sweetmeats when he did so. She declined, saying she herself would be leaving within the hour, although she indicated she would return by 7:30 for dinner, asking Ho to prepare meatballs and rice. When he returned, she was gone. The family's gatekeeper had seen her leave with her bicycle. After leaving, Pamela met friend Ethel Gurevich, a daughter of Russian émigrés, whom she had known for 5 years, at the Wagenslitz Hotel, a popular gathering place for the city's foreign community, per an agreement the two had made the day before. Pamela told Gurevich she had been there earlier and left briefly before returning to meet her. Afterwards they went back to the Gurevich home, where Ethel's mother served the two tea, buttered bread and cake. Pamela ate very little, saying she was not hungry. Pamela and Gurevich then went out to an ice skating rink operated by a French company, arriving around 6 p.m., where they skated with a third friend, Lilian Marinovsky, another Russian. The three remained together for most of the time they were there, except for one brief period when Pamela went to speak to another girl. Around 7:30 p.m. Gurevich recalled that Pamela said she had to go home for dinner. They asked her if she felt comfortable returning home alone at night. She told them she always went by herself and that nothing can happen to me here in Peking. Marinovsky saw her bicycle away, with her skates over her shoulder. It was the last time anyone is known to have seen Pamela alive. By 8 p.m. Pamela had still not returned home, although her father had. Around 10:30 p.m., he asked Ho to go to the skating rink and see if she was there. By the time he arrived, the rink had closed and workers were cleaning up for the evening. They could not tell him anything specifically about Pamela as, they said, there had been around 200 people skating at the rink over the course of the evening. Ho returned to the Werner residence, where E.T.C. told him to go home for the night. By the older man's later testimony, he went out himself with an electric torch to look for his daughter, returning at 1 a.m. and going to bed. Later he would claim he had spent most of the night looking for her. Shortly after 8 a.m. the next day, two rickshaw pullers near the Fox Tower, along the city's old walls, noticed a group of wild dogs showing interest in a bundle, lying in the ditch near the wall, all that remained of the canal that had formerly run along it. An elderly man saw this too, and went down to take a closer look. After finding it was the severely beaten and stabbed body of what appeared to be a young European woman, he ran to the nearest police box, a quarter of a mile away, to report it. The rickshaw drivers secured the scene, keeping the dogs away and covering the body with a bamboo mat to discourage curious onlookers until detectives could arrive. Colonel Han Shicheng of the Peking police supervised the investigation. At first, he presumed the decedent to have been yet another of the many Russian whites who, overwhelmed by despair and or out of options, had ended their own lives. The preceding night having been Christmas in the Russian Orthodox calendar lent some support to this. But the wounds seemed more extensive than those a suicide might inflict. Aware that the possible killing of a wealthy foreign woman just outside the legation quarter might be of interest to the foreign authorities there, even though the Chinese had jurisdiction, Han called W.P. Thomas, the legation quarter's police commissioner, to the scene. Uncertainty over the woman's identity ended when Werner stumbled across the scene a short while later. After resting at his home, he had resumed his search for his daughter in the morning light and left a note about her disappearance with Thomas's office. When he saw the body, he shrieked, "Pamela," and collapsed next to the body. He had apparently recognized the clothing and jewelry she was wearing. Later, a constable with the foreign legation who also knew Pamela confirmed the identification. By the evening, the crime scene had been secured and processed, and Pamela's body was taken to Peking Union Medical College to be autopsied. There were plenty of deaths to investigate in Peking at that time. Each morning, several bodies were routinely collected from the streets. Most were suicides or natural causes. Homicides were harder to resolve as they could have been either due to routine criminal activity and disputes, or Japanese provocations, or, increasingly, political assassinations carried out by the Kuomintang of its enemies, both internal and external. General Song was also having some of the drug dealers he caught summarily executed, particularly if they were not Chinese or Japanese. Both Han and Thomas knew that the investigation into Pamela's death would be unusual. While the Chinese had jurisdiction because of where her body had been found, it was entirely likely that it would be necessary to investigate her death by questioning members of the foreign community, some of whom might enjoy diplomatic immunity or at least reside in the legation quarter, where the Peking police had no authority. That aspect of the investigation would be better conducted by law enforcement officers who did have jurisdiction. Given Pamela's social standing, the case would likely attract not only the attention of the press, but also official interest. British diplomats would probably not want to see the case solved in any way that would adversely affect the British image in China. Thomas proposed to Han that the Peking police exercise their right to name the official who could serve as an envoy for the investigation, and suggested that that official be Detective Chief Inspector Richard Dennis, a Scotland Yard veteran who was Chief of Police in the British concession in Tientsin. He could not be as easily pressured by the diplomatic service since he was not under their authority. Han agreed, and the two would work together to try to solve the case, a binational cooperation unusual for the time. Pamela's body, and where it was found, had already yielded some clues. The expensive platinum jewelry that had helped confirm the corpse's identity had not been taken, suggesting robbery was not the motive. Pamela's wristwatch had been stopped shortly after midnight, suggesting that was when she had died. There was no blood at the scene other than that on her clothes, suggesting she had been killed elsewhere and dumped there. Nearby was her membership card for the skating rink, with some blood on it. However, her bicycle and skates were never found. The autopsy yielded additional information of interest. Pamela had died from a brain hemorrhage caused by several blows to the head, possibly inflicted with a smooth-surfaced piece of wood or stone, blows strong enough to fracture her skull. From the proximity necessary to inflict those blows, and their directness, the pathologists performing the autopsy concluded she had been killed by someone she knew. A similar blunt force trauma injury to the right arm was believed to have been inflicted after death, because there was no hemorrhaging around it. Likewise, the low amount of blood released from the stabbings and slashings suggested those, too, were post-mortem. They had been inflicted with a knife, likely with 2 edges to the blade, although possibly not equally sharp, at least 4 inches long. Within the body, muscles had been severed cleanly. Through 2 slits in the abdomen, most of Pamela's internal organs had been removed and her blood drained. The skill required to do this as cleanly and quickly as it had been done suggested to the pathologists that whoever had done so had considerable skill, perhaps that of a surgeon or anatomist. The dogs that had been showing interest in the body could not have inflicted those wounds. Pamela's heart was also missing, with the ribs surrounding it broken from the inside to do so, a task requiring a considerable amount of force. A knife had also been used to repeatedly penetrate her vagina, to the point that it could not be determined whether Pamela had been sexually assaulted either before or after she was killed. One of the few internal organs that remained was Pamela's stomach. It was found to contain some partially digested Chinese food. Since she had not been known to have eaten anything other than the bread, cake, and tea she had had at her friend's house, this along with the time her watch stopped suggested she had been alive for several hours after leaving the ice rink. The time of death was placed between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Pamela's skirt was loose. Her silk stockings had been torn, and her underwear was missing. However, her overcoat and scarf were still with the body, along with shoes and some other personal effects. This further argued for the killing having taken place elsewhere, and the body being dressed afterwards. It was concluded that the killing had been sexually motivated, not the work of an ordinary sexual sadist, according to an obstetrician-gynecologist who participated. Hahn and the doctors who performed the autopsy believed that the intent had been to dismember Pamela after her death, but that whoever was doing so was unable to complete the task and hastily dumped the body. Hahn made sure distribution of the autopsy report was limited as he did not want the details of the mutilation widely reported in the press, since that would make the case harder to solve. He kept the only copy in his desk. Werner finally returned to England, where he died in 1954. Werner's lengthy obituary in the Times noted Pamela's murder in passing, in a short paragraph about his family, which would be the last time the crime was mentioned in any prominent published source for the remainder of the 20th century. Pamela and her mother were buried in the English cemetery, now under the pavement of modern Beijing's Second Ring Road.